My name is Sophie Brown. I'm in my early 30s, and most days I live a life that looks ordinary in the best way. I work hard, I keep my promises, and I pay my bills on time. I'm the person who remembers birthdays, who answers the phone when someone's stranded, who brings a calm voice into a messy room. If you met me once, you might describe me as steady. If you met my family, you might hear a different word: easy. Easy to lean on, easy to overlook. Easy to assume will say yes, because I usually do, and because I don't make a performance out of my boundaries. I don't raise my voice, I don't slam doors, I don't post indirect quotes online. I've never been good at turning pain into a spectacle, even when part of me wished I could. People sometimes mistake that quietness for softness. Sometimes I let them. I'm telling you this story because something happened that still feels unreal when I say it out loud. My brother used my name to sign a loan I never approved. And the worst part wasn't even the money. It was the way trust, years of it, stitched into every holiday, every favor, every we're family, turned into legal damage overnight. One day, I was a daughter and a sister doing my best. The next day, I was a person staring at documents with my name on them, realizing that family doesn't protect you from paperwork. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not a story about humiliating anyone or watching someone crash and burn while I stand there smiling. I don't even know how to write that version because it's not what happened. What happened was quieter, slower, more human. There were moments when I wanted to scream, and moments when I didn't feel anything at all, just a kind of cold clarity that surprised me. If you've ever been the reliable one, you'll recognize the early parts. The small dismissals you excuse, the roles you accept because it keeps peace, the way you learn to swallow discomfort and call it maturity. And then there's the turn, when you realize that staying quiet isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's consent. Sometimes it's how people learn that they can keep going. Over the course of this story, I'm going to walk you through what I did and why I did it. The decisions I made without theatrics, the boundaries I set without shouting, the legal steps I took without turning it into a family war, at least not on purpose. You'll hear about grief that doesn't look dramatic and strength that doesn't need witnesses. You'll hear how I stayed calm, not because I was unhurt, but because I refused to let my hurt make my choices for me. I'm going to tell it honestly. Not to punish my brother, not to make myself look flawless, just to explain how quickly love can become a liability and how quietly a person can take their life back. Before we start, have you ever trusted someone so completely that you didn't realize you were unprotected until it was too late? To my family, I was the steady one. Not the favorite, not the fragile one, not the one whose moods everyone learned to tiptoe around. I was the constant. The background hum made everything else sound normal. If someone needed help moving, I showed up early. If a bill deadline was missed, I spotted it before the lights went out. If an argument started heating up, I was the person who said, "Let's just take a breath," and meant it. That role didn't come from nowhere. I was the younger sister who learned early that being useful earned you space. My brother was louder, sharper-edged, more openly ambitious. He took up oxygen in a room without asking. I learned how to fold myself smaller, not in a tragic way, just enough to fit wherever I was needed. Teachers called me mature for my age. Relatives called me easygoing. Neither of those labels ever sounded like praise to me, but I wore them anyway. At family gatherings, my presence was assumed, not announced. No one asked if I was tired, they asked if I could help. No one wondered what I needed, they told me what they needed from me, and I complied, not because I was afraid, but because I believed that this was what love looked like in practice. You show up. You don't make things harder. You absorb inconvenience so others don't have to. If I'm honest, I was proud of that identity. I liked being trusted. I liked being the one people leaned on when things went wrong. There's a quiet power in reliability, even if it's invisible from the outside. And for a long time, I didn't question the cost of it. I told myself that every family needs someone like me, the anchor, the translator, the emotional shock absorber. My brother, especially, benefited from that dynamic. He borrowed things without asking and returned them late, if at all. He made plans assuming I would adjust mine. He spoke over me in conversations, not aggressively, just with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been challenged on it. When he said, You don't mind, right? It wasn't really a question, and I answered the way I always did. It's fine. That phrase became my signature. It's fine. I said it when it wasn't fine. I said it when something tightened in my chest, and I didn't have language for why. I said it because correcting people felt like an overreaction, and I'd been trained, by tone, by silence, by years of subtle reinforcement, that overreacting was worse than being wronged. From the outside, our family looked functional, loving even. We didn't scream, we didn't cut each other off, we didn't air dirty laundry. Inside that calm, though, there were unspoken hierarchies. Certain people's mistakes were minimized, certain people's discomfort was treated as negotiable. Mine usually was. I don't tell you this to paint myself as a victim. At the time, I didn't feel like one. I felt responsible, capable, needed. It's only in hindsight that I can see how being the reliable one slowly became being the expendable one, the person whose boundaries were assumed to be flexible because they always had been. If you'd asked me back then who I was to my family, I would have said something like, I'm the one who keeps things running. I wouldn't have mentioned resentment because I didn't think I had any. I wouldn't have mentioned fear because I didn't know it was there. I certainly wouldn't have imagined a future where my name would appear on legal documents I'd never seen, tied to decisions I'd never agreed to. Back then, I thought trust was protection. I thought love meant safety by default, and I thought that staying quiet was the same as staying kind. I was wrong, but it took time, and paperwork, and a very specific kind of betrayal to understand why. The first time something felt off, it was small enough that I almost didn't register it as a problem. That's how these things usually begin, not with a crisis, but with a detail that doesn't sit quite right and then gets smoothed over by habit. My brother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember that because Tuesdays were my long days at work, the kind where I stayed late just to feel finished. His voice was casual, upbeat, the way it always was when he wanted something but didn't want it to sound like a request. Hey, Soph, he said, quick question. Those two words, quick question, had become a prelude to inconvenience, but I answered anyway. I was used to it. He asked if I'd ever received mail at my old address after I moved. Nothing dramatic, just curiosity, he said. I told him yes, sometimes, and that I usually forwarded anything important. He hummed like that, answered something for him. Why? I asked. Oh, no reason, he said. Just checking. We hung up, and that should have been the end of it. Except it wasn't. A few weeks later, I noticed a soft credit check on my report. I only saw it because I had a habit, almost a compulsion, of checking things. Dates, statements, numbers. It wasn't panic-inducing, just odd. I hadn't applied for anything. I assumed it was a mistake, or a pre-approval inquiry, or one of those background processes no one explains because no one thinks to ask. I mentioned it to my mother in passing, the way you mention a weird dream or a flickering light. She shrugged it off. Those things happen all the time, she said. You're probably overthinking it. Overthinking. Another word I knew well. I didn't push. I told myself I trusted my family. I told myself not everything needed to be investigated. I told myself that questioning something without evidence was just anxiety looking for a story. So I did what I always did. I filed the discomfort away and went back to being functional. Then came the second cut. My brother asked if he could list me as an emergency contact on some paperwork. He was vague about what kind of paperwork, and I didn't ask. I said yes automatically. Emergency contact felt harmless, almost flattering in a strange way, like I mattered. A few days after that, he texted me asking for my full legal name, exactly as it appears on my ID. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to notice the hesitation. Then I sent it. We'd grown up together. He knew my name. Why would that matter? Looking back, I can see how carefully nothing was framed as a big deal. No single request crossed a line on its own. Each one existed in plausible territory. Each one relied on the same assumption, that I wouldn't interrogate it. The first actual alarm didn't sound until a thin white envelope arrived at my apartment, forwarded from my old address. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even aggressive. It was polite, neutral, almost friendly. Inside was a notice, formal but not urgent. My name, spelled correctly, a reference number, language about verification and next steps. It wasn't a bill. Not yet. It wasn't a warning. Just a statement that something existed in my name. I remember standing in my kitchen, the paper in my hand, feeling a strange dissociation settle in, like I was reading about someone else. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a clerical error, a mix-up with someone who had a similar name. That kind of thing happened, didn't it? I called my brother that night. He didn't answer. He texted later. In a meeting, what's up? I typed and deleted 3 different messages before settling on something neutral. Got a weird letter with my name on it. Do you know anything about it? There was a pause. Not long enough to be suspicious, but long enough to be noticeable. He replied, not sure. What's it about? I stared at the screen, that small space between us suddenly feeling much larger. The first instinct I had was to reassure him, to soften it, to say it was probably nothing. It was probably nothing. And I almost did. Instead, I said I'd explain later, that I just wanted to check. That night, I didn't sleep well. Not because I was panicking, but because something in me had started paying attention in a new way. A quiet alertness. Like a system that had been idling, it suddenly came online. No one else seemed concerned. No one raised their voice. No confrontation happened. On the surface, everything was normal. But that was the first small cut. The moment when trust didn't shatter, but thinned. And once something thins, you start noticing every place it might tear. After that envelope, nothing exploded. There was no dramatic phone call, no confession, no late-night argument where everything spilled out at once. Life continued in its usual rhythm, which, in a way, made everything more confusing. When nothing bad happens immediately, your mind works overtime to convince you that nothing bad will happen. So I normalized it. I told myself that if there were a real problem, someone would have contacted me more clearly. I told myself that institutions don't operate in half phrases and reference numbers. I told myself that my brother wouldn't do anything that would put me at risk. That belief wasn't blind, it was inherited. It had been reinforced for years by the idea that family, whatever its flaws, had limits it would never cross. In the meantime, the small dismissals continued. Not dramatic ones, not the kind you could point to and say, there, that's it. Just a pattern of my concerns being smoothed over before they could harden into questions. When I brought the letter up again at dinner, my brother laughed it off. You worry too much, he said, reaching for the salt. It's probably just junk mail. My parents nodded, relieved by the simplicity of that explanation. No one wanted complexity at the table. No one wanted paperwork to compete with food. And I let it go. That became the theme of that year. Letting things go. I let go of the fact that my brother had started asking unusually specific questions about my finances. Whether I'd ever co-signed anything before, how long my credit history was, and whether I still used the same bank. Each time, it was framed as curiosity, or future planning, or hypothetical conversations about how the system works. I answered carefully, but I still answered. I let go of the discomfort I felt when he joked about me being the responsible one, the implication hanging in the air that responsibility made me a resource. I let go of the way my parents praised my patience in the same breath that they excused his impulsiveness. One of us was stable, the other was figuring things out. Stability, I learned, comes with expectations. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being the only one who notices a pattern. It makes you doubt your own perception. You start asking yourself whether you're being unfair, whether you're projecting, whether you're making something out of nothing. And because I had built an identity around being reasonable, the last thing I wanted was to become the person who saw threats where none existed. So I rationalized. I explained away the inconsistencies. I told myself that if my brother had really done something wrong, I would feel it more strongly. I told myself that discomfort wasn't evidence. Meanwhile, more letters arrived, still neutral, still technical. Each one added another thread to a picture I didn't want to finish drawing. I opened them alone, skimmed them, and stacked them neatly in my black notebook, folded behind blank pages. I didn't tell anyone about that part. The normalization didn't happen all at once. It happened through repetition. Every time I ignored my instincts, and nothing visibly bad followed, it became easier to ignore them again. Silence started to feel like the mature choice, like restraint, like love. My brother noticed my quiet compliance, even if he didn't consciously name it. He began assuming access, not just to my time, but to my information. He spoke about plans that included me without asking. He framed decisions as already made. And when I hesitated, he'd tilt his head and say, "I thought you were okay with it." That sentence did more work than any argument could have. It turned my boundaries into surprises. It made my discomfort seem like a deviation instead of a response. I remember one moment in particular. We were sitting in his car, parked outside a grocery store. He was talking about a business idea, something vague and ambitious. He said, half joking, "Worst case, I'd never let anything fall back on you." The word fall landed strangely. I asked him what he meant. He waved his hand. "You know, just saying, family looks out for each other." I nodded. Because that was the script, and because challenging it would have required me to admit, out loud, that I was scared. What I didn't realize then was that by normalizing the disrespect, I was also normalizing my own erasure. Each time I chose peace over clarity, I taught the people around me that my consent was assumed, not required. I wasn't just being overlooked, I was being used as a constant in other people's equations. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I believed that staying quiet was the ethical thing to do. I believed that protecting relationships mattered more than protecting myself. That belief held, right up until the moment it didn't, because there's a limit to how much you can normalize before reality forces your hand. And when that moment comes, all the explanations in the world won't undo the damage that silence allowed. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly understand my place in the family. It revealed itself slowly, in the way you realize you've been standing in the same position for years and everyone else has been arranging themselves around you. I was the stabilizer, not the decision maker, not the one consulted before risks were taken. I was the one expected to absorb the consequences quietly, if something went wrong. The emotional ballast. The person whose life was presumed flexible enough to accommodate other people's chaos. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. My brother talked about his plans as if they were already facts. He spoke in forward motion, when this works, after I get through this phase, and my role in those narratives was never explicit, but it was implied. I was the safety net that didn't need to be discussed, the floor beneath his risk-taking, the assumption that if something cracked, I would be there to hold it together. My parents reinforced that role without realizing it. They praised my level-headedness whenever conflict arose. They reminded me that my brother was under pressure, that he didn't mean harm, that he just needed time. Time, apparently, was something I had in unlimited supply. When I expressed even mild concern, it was reframed as worry. When I asked for clarity, it was framed as anxiety. And when I went quiet, it was taken as agreement. There's a subtle violence in that kind of role assignment. Not the kind that leaves bruises, but the kind that erases your right to be surprised. If you are the stable one, you're not supposed to react. You're supposed to adjust. I started noticing how often decisions were made around me. Not against me. Around me. As if my consent were a technicality that could be filled in later. As if my identity had been reduced to a function. She'll handle it. Even my own language reflected it. When people asked how I was doing, I answered with updates about everyone else. When something bothered me, I framed it as an inconvenience rather than harm. I had internalized the idea that my discomfort was less important than maintaining equilibrium. The irony was that I had real power, just not the kind that announces itself. I understood systems. I knew how processes worked. I noticed patterns and kept records. But none of that mattered as long as I was cast as the emotional infrastructure rather than a person with agency. The letters kept coming. By then, I wasn't shocked by them. I was methodical. I read them carefully. I highlighted phrases. I looked up terminology late at night, my laptop glowing in the dark while the rest of the apartment slept. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. The role I'd been assigned didn't include suspicion or preparation. I realized something unsettling. My family's trust in me wasn't the same as respect. Trust meant they believed I wouldn't cause trouble. Respect would have meant they checked before involving me in trouble at all. Once I named that difference, everything sharpened. The jokes didn't sound harmless anymore. The reassurances sounded hollow. The requests sounded like expectations wearing polite clothing. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not yet, because understanding your role doesn't automatically free you from it. There's a kind of grief that comes with realizing that the people you love have been relating to a version of you that exists mostly for their convenience. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror one morning, brushing my teeth, and thinking, if something is wrong, they'll expect me to fix it, even if I didn't break it. That was the role. The fixer without authority, the stabilizer without consent, the person who made everyone else's lives smoother by making her own smaller. And the most dangerous part was this. I had helped build that role. Every time I said it's fine when it wasn't. Every time I chose harmony over honesty. Every time I let assumptions stand because correcting them felt impolite. Recognizing that didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way, less accommodating, more observant, as if a part of me had stepped back and started taking notes instead of participating. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with that awareness. I just knew that whatever came next couldn't involve pretending anymore. The role I'd been assigned was no longer one I could survive. Something was going to have to shift, not outwardly, not dramatically, internally. The shift didn't happen during an argument or a revelation. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no moment where I finally stood up for myself in a way that would make a good clip. It happened on a quiet Saturday morning in my apartment, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the black notebook open in front of me. I'd started keeping everything in one place without consciously deciding to. Letters, dates, names, reference numbers. I told myself it was just organization. In reality, it was instinct. That morning, I did something different. Instead of skimming, I read every document slowly, line by line. I didn't assume goodwill. I didn't fill in gaps with trust. I read as if the person named in those papers wasn't my brother, but a stranger. That distance changed everything. Patterns emerged that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Timelines lined up too cleanly. The questions my brother had asked suddenly made sense in a way that made my stomach drop. The soft credit check, the request for my legal name. The mail is at my old address. None of it was random. Still, I didn't feel panic. What I felt was something colder and steadier. Clarity. I pulled my credit report in full, not the summary version I'd glanced at before. I sat with it, scrolling, noting each entry. There it was, a loan account, opened months earlier, active. My name was attached to it as if it belonged there. I remember the exact thought that passed through my mind. Oh, so this is real. How could he do this? What am I going to do? Just an acknowledgement, like seeing the ground clearly after the fog lifts. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched people pass on the street below. Someone was walking a dog. Someone else was carrying groceries. Life was continuing in a way that felt almost offensive in its normality. That was the moment I stopped seeing myself as a participant in a family misunderstanding and started seeing myself as a person in a legal situation. The emotional framing fell away. What remained were facts. I didn't call my brother. I didn't call my parents. I didn't even cry. I sat back down and started making a list, not of grievances, but of steps. There was grief in that moment, but it was quiet. Grief for the version of my family I'd believed in. Grief for the assumption that love automatically meant protection. Grief for the younger version of me who thought being reliable would keep her safe. Something else shifted, too. My relationship with silence. Up until then, silence had been avoidance, politeness, and fear of escalation. In that moment, it became a choice, a tool. I realized that if I spoke too soon, I would be pulled back into the role of stabilizer. I would be asked to understand, to forgive, to delay. The situation would become emotional before it became accurate, and accuracy mattered now. So I stayed quiet. That didn't mean doing nothing. It meant doing the right things without announcing them. I researched carefully and anonymously. I learned what identity misuse looked like in legal language. I learned what timelines mattered and which didn't. I learned that intention didn't change documentation. Each fact I gathered grounded me further. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't plotting. I was orienting myself. The shift was internal, but decisive. I stopped asking why and started asking what now. I stopped seeing my brother's behavior as a family issue and started seeing it as a boundary violation with consequences. That reframing didn't make me cruel. It made it clear. Later that day, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother about a family dinner the following week. I stared at it for a long time before replying with a simple thumbs up. Not because everything was okay, but because nothing needed to be said yet. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I wasn't even ready to name what I knew. I was ready to protect myself. That day marked the end of something, even though no one else noticed, the end of blind trust, the end of automatic forgiveness. The end of my silence was something other people could rely on. From that point on, every quiet choice I made was deliberate. And that was the beginning of a very different kind of power. Once silence became intentional, it felt different in my body. Less like shrinking, more like stillness. I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I was conserving it. In the days that followed, I moved through my life as if nothing had changed, and that was the strangest part. I went to work. I answered emails. I smiled at neighbors. From the outside, I looked the same. Inside, I was recalibrating every assumption I'd ever made about access to my time, my information, my identity. My brother called twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I wasn't ready to hear his voice. I knew what would happen if I did. He would sound familiar, normal, maybe even affectionate, and familiarity has a way of dulling clarity. When he texted, I replied politely and briefly. Neutral words, no openings, no emotional cues. I didn't accuse him. I didn't reassure him either. That balance unsettled him more than anger ever could have, though I didn't realize that until later. My parents noticed my distance before my brother did. My mother asked if I was stressed at work. My father told me I seemed quiet lately, as if that were new. I nodded. I let them fill the silence with explanations that didn't require my confirmation. That was the first time I understood how much of my family's emotional rhythm depended on my participation. When I stopped smoothing things over, the air felt slightly unstable. Not enough for anyone to panic, but enough to be noticed. They mistook my silence for compliance, or fatigue, or maturity. It fit their existing narrative of me too well to question. The idea that I might be withholding information never occurred to them. And that misinterpretation gave me room. I used that space to prepare, not dramatically, but thoroughly. I requested official copies of documents. I logged dates and times. I learned the difference between fraud and misuse, between intent and impact. I learned what words mattered and which ones were just noise. I also learned something about myself. I learned that I could sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately, that I didn't have to explain myself in real time. That urgency was not the same as importance. There were moments when anger flared, sharp, brief, when I imagined confronting my brother and watching his face change, when I imagined my parents' shock, their scrambling to make sense of it. But I let those images pass. They belonged to a version of me that needed validation more than resolution. This version needed outcomes. Silence in this phase was not passive. It was strategic. Every day I didn't speak, I gathered more information. Every interaction I kept neutral prevented the situation from becoming a family debate instead of a legal reality. I refused to let it be reframed as a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. My brother grew bolder. He asked for favors again, small ones, rides, opinions, the occasional, "Can you check something for me?" Each request assumed continuity. Each one tested whether the old dynamic still held. I declined without explanation. "Can't this week?" "Not sure." "I'll get back to you." Those phrases felt foreign at first. I was used to over-explaining, to cushioning refusals with apologies. Stripping my responses down to their essentials felt almost impolite, but it also felt honest. No one confronted me about the change. That told me everything I needed to know. As long as my withdrawal didn't inconvenience them too much, it wasn't worth addressing. I also became aware of how carefully I'd been managing other people's emotions my entire life. When I stopped doing that, I had energy for myself for the first time in years. That energy went into preparation, not confrontation. Silence allowed me to move without resistance. It allowed me to see how people behaved when they assumed I wasn't paying attention. And it allowed me to choose my timing instead of reacting to theirs. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology that might never come. I wasn't waiting for someone else to make it right. I was building a position I could stand on, regardless of how anyone else responded. And the more deliberate my silence became, the clearer one thing grew. They thought I was still the same person. They had no idea that the ground under that assumption was already shifting. What they never noticed wasn't just what I was doing. It was how I was doing it, and how long I'd been capable of it. I've always paid attention, not in an anxious way, but in a methodical one. I notice patterns because they help me make sense of the world. I notice inconsistencies because they tend to matter later. For most of my life, that skill had been used in the service of other people, anticipating needs, smoothing transitions, preventing problems before they became visible. Now I redirected it. Every evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and that black notebook. The notebook wasn't sentimental, it was functional. I logged dates of calls, exact wording from messages, and reference numbers from documents. I didn't speculate, I didn't editorialize. I wrote only what could be verified. What surprised me most was how calm I felt doing it. There was no adrenaline, no sense of urgency, just focus. I treated the situation like a system that needed to be understood before it could be corrected. Systems don't respond to emotion, they respond to precision. I learned the language of lending agreements. I learned how signatures are authenticated, how addresses are verified, and how responsibility is assigned when identity is misused. I learned how long I had before certain consequences would solidify, and which actions would lock me into outcomes I couldn't undo. I also learned something uncomfortable: how easy it had been for my brother to do what he did. Not because the system was careless, but because I had been accessible. My information had never felt protected, even to me. It had been shared freely, casually, under the assumption that no one would ever exploit it. That assumption was part of the vulnerability. I didn't blame myself for that, but I noted it. While I was preparing, my family life continued as if nothing were happening. Group chats buzzed with mundane updates, plans were made, jokes were shared. My brother acted normal, almost overly so, friendly, light, as if proximity alone could reset whatever distance he sensed. I watched him closely in those interactions. Not suspiciously, analytically. He avoided specifics. He deflected whenever finances came up. He spoke in generalities. Things are tight. It's all temporary. I've got it handled. He never once asked me directly if I was okay. He never once checked whether anything had arrived in my name. That told me more than a confession would have. I also noticed what didn't happen. No one asked why I'd stopped helping so much. No one asked why I no longer volunteered information. No one asked what I was thinking. My absence of effort was absorbed without comment, which confirmed what I had suspected for years. My presence had been functional, not relational. Preparation became a kind of quiet grief processing. Each document I understood fully replaced a layer of denial with acceptance. This wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. It was an action that had already happened, with consequences already in motion. So I prepared for reality, not reconciliation. I contacted institutions, not to accuse, but to ask procedural questions, hypotheticals. If someone discovered an account they didn't open, what steps would matter? I listened carefully to the answers. I took notes. I also learned when not to act. There were moments I could have intervened earlier, emotionally, moments I could have confronted my brother and forced an explanation. But explanations don't reverse contracts. They only complicate timelines. What they never noticed was that I was no longer orienting myself around their reactions. I wasn't planning how to explain myself. I wasn't preparing speeches. I wasn't rehearsing outcomes. I was positioning. That kind of preparation is invisible to people who rely on your transparency. When someone is used to you being open, they don't recognize discretion as a change. They interpret it as calm, or distraction, or acceptance. They didn't see the binders I created digitally, the screenshots, the saved PDFs, the dates cross-referenced against messages. They didn't see the way I separated facts from feelings so that neither would contaminate the other. They didn't see that I had already stopped framing this as a family problem and started framing it as a matter of personal sovereignty. One night, after finishing a call with a customer service representative, I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. Not sad, not angry, just aware. Aware that once I moved forward, the old version of my family would no longer exist in the same way. Not because I would destroy it, but because I would no longer protect it from consequences. That awareness didn't feel like power in the dramatic sense. It felt like gravity, quiet, inescapable, neutral. I went to bed that night knowing something they didn't. I was ready. And readiness, I was learning, is rarely loud. The private reveal didn't arrive like a shock. It arrived like confirmation. By the time it happened, I already knew, at least in outline, what I was going to find. What I didn't know was how cleanly the pieces would align once I saw them together. There's a difference between suspicion and certainty. Suspicion keeps you restless. Certainty makes you still. It came during a routine follow-up call with a compliance department. I'd framed the conversation carefully, sticking to process, never names, hypotheticals, verification pathways. I was calm enough that the person on the other end spoke freely, assuming I was just another case in their day. They walked me through the documentation attached to the loan, the application timeline, the address used, the digital signature method, the contact email. Every detail landed with a dull, steady weight. The address was my old one. The contact email was an account I recognized immediately, not mine, but one my brother had used for years for side projects. The phone number matched his. The signature was legally valid, generated through a method that required access to information only someone close to me would have. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where I gasped or had to sit down. I thanked the representative, ended the call, and stared at the wall for a long time. This was the private reveal. Not just that my brother had used my name, but that he had done it confidently, methodically, with the assumption that I would never challenge it. That assumption hurt more than the act itself. I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of a fresh page. This was not an accident. Writing it down didn't feel vindictive. It felt grounding. It stopped my mind from circling back into excuses, from wondering if I'd misunderstood, from searching for a version of events that required less courage from me. What surprised me was the absence of rage. I had expected anger to finally arrive once everything was clear. Instead, what I felt was distance. Emotional distance, like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the full composition. I saw how long the setup had been, how carefully my accessibility had been used, how my role as the responsible one had made me an ideal cover. Someone unlikely to default, someone unlikely to complain, someone unlikely to involve outsiders. I also saw something else, leverage. Not the cinematic kind, not a secret weapon, just reality, documented and aligned. The timeline mattered, the method mattered, the fact that I had not confronted anyone yet mattered. The system cared about sequence, not sentiment. That knowledge didn't make me feel powerful, it made me feel sober. I realized that from this point on, every choice would close certain doors permanently. I could still try to handle it within the family. I could still absorb the damage quietly. I could still let the narrative become about stress, pressure, and intentions. Or I could let the facts speak in the language they were written in. I didn't decide anything that day. The decision would come later. What I did instead was something simpler and harder. I accepted that the version of my brother I had trusted no longer existed for me in the same way. That acceptance didn't mean I stopped loving him. It meant I stopped protecting him from the consequences of his choices. I went for a long walk that evening. No music, no phone, just movement. I watched the city move around me, indifferent to my internal shift. Couples argued quietly on street corners. Someone laughed too loudly outside a bar. A busker played the same song twice. I thought about how many times I'd told myself that family loyalty meant endurance. How many times have I stayed silent because speaking felt like betrayal? And how strange it was to realize that loyalty without limits isn't loyalty at all. It's self-erasure. The private reveal wasn't just about uncovering the truth of the loan. It was about uncovering the truth of my position. I was not powerless. I was not confused. And I was not obligated to make this painless for anyone else. When I got home, I placed the notebook back in its drawer and locked my laptop. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel the urge to research or document anything else. There was nothing more to uncover. From that point forward, the question was no longer what happened. It was what I was willing to live with. And once that question is asked honestly, there's no one asking it. The decision point didn't arrive with urgency. No deadline blinked on my calendar. No one called demanding an answer. That, in a way, made it harder. When there's no immediate pressure, you have to confront your values without the excuse of panic. I gave myself time. Not to avoid the decision, but to make sure I wasn't reacting. I wanted the choice to come from clarity, not shock. I laid out the options the way I would at work, detached and practical. Option 1. Handle it privately. Confront my brother. demand that he fix it, hope he could, hope he would. This path relied on trust, the very thing that had already been breached. It also required me to delay formal action, which could be interpreted later as acceptance. Option 2. Absorb the damage. Take responsibility for a debt I didn't authorize. Protect my family from embarrassment. Preserve appearances. This option was quiet, familiar, and devastating in slow motion. It would cost me financially, legally, and psychologically, but it would keep the story intact. Option 3. Involve the system. Treat the situation as what it was, not what I wished it had been. Document, report. Let the process unfold without cushioning it for anyone. Each option carried a loss. There was no clean exit. What tipped the balance wasn't anger. It was something more uncomfortable, self-respect. I asked myself a question I had never asked so directly before. What does choosing myself actually look like? Not in theory, not in slogans, in consequences. Choosing myself meant accepting that my parents would be hurt, that my brother would feel exposed, that family gatherings would never feel neutral again. It meant releasing the fantasy that I could protect everyone if I were just careful enough. I thought about the younger version of me who had learned to equate usefulness with worth. I thought about how many times I'd told myself that being reliable meant being safe. And I thought about the quiet, corrosive message I would be sending if I chose silence again. That message would be, this is acceptable. I couldn't live with that. The irreversible option became clear, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. Involving the system wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of alignment between what had happened and how it would be addressed. Once I saw it that way, the fear shifted. It didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became something I could carry. I made the first move on a Monday morning. Not ceremonially, not angrily. I filed the initial report with a neutral tone and complete documentation. I used precise language. I avoided emotional descriptors. I stated facts and attached evidence. When I clicked submit, I didn't feel relief. I felt gravity. There was no going back from that point. Even if my brother somehow fixed everything overnight, even if apologies came pouring in, the record would exist. The truth would be outside my control now. I sat back in my chair and waited for something to happen internally. For guilt. For doubt. For regret. None of it came. What I felt instead was a strange steadiness. The kind you feel after stepping onto solid ground following a long period of balancing on something unstable. It wasn't joy, it was orientation. I didn't tell my family what I'd done. Not yet. The process had its own timeline, and I wasn't interested in managing reactions in advance. I had spent too many years preemptively soothing outcomes that weren't mine to own. The decision point, I realized, wasn't just about the loan. It was about ending a pattern, about choosing to be a person with boundaries, even when those boundaries made other people uncomfortable. That choice changed something fundamental in me. It redefined responsibility, not as absorbing harm, but as responding appropriately to it. I knew there would be consequences. I also knew they wouldn't all be visible right away. Some would unfold slowly, like pressure redistributing itself through a system. I took a deep breath, closed my notebook, and went to work. The machinery was in motion now, and I wasn't going to interfere with it. Once the process began, my role shifted again, this time into something almost invisible. There were no dramatic updates, no phone calls announcing progress, just confirmations, case numbers. Timelines are measured in weeks instead of moments. The system didn't rush, and neither did I. I moved in silence, not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing to explain yet. At work, I stayed focused. I met deadlines, I led meetings. No one could have guessed that every evening I was tracking correspondence from institutions that now knew my name for reasons I never consented to. That duality, ordinary life on the surface, quiet reckoning underneath, became strangely grounding. It reminded me that this situation, however consuming, was not my entire identity. My brother, meanwhile, sensed a shift he couldn't place. He checked in more often. Not urgently, casually. You okay? Haven't heard from you much. I replied when necessary, briefly, kindly. I didn't offer reassurance and I didn't offer accusation. Silence, when consistent, becomes its own boundary. My parents invited me over for dinner. I went, I ate, I asked about their garden, I listened, I didn't volunteer anything. They mistook my calm for resolution, for the assumption that whatever distance they'd felt had already passed. That misreading protected me. Moving in silence required discipline. There were moments when I wanted to tell my mother everything, to relieve her before she even knew there was something to be relieved from. There were moments when I wanted to confront my brother simply to watch him react, to confirm what I already knew. But reaction was not the goal. The actions I took during that time were administrative, almost boring in their precision. Follow-ups, clarifications, requests for confirmation in writing. I learned how to let officials do their jobs without interference. I didn't dramatize, I didn't minimize, I stayed factual. What no one saw was how much restraint that took. Silence is often mistaken for ease. In reality, it's an effort. It means holding your ground internally while allowing others to remain unaware of the shift beneath them. It means not reaching for emotional shortcuts that might feel satisfying but weaken your position. My brother made a mistake during this period. A small one, but decisive. He tried to be proactive. He sent me a message suggesting we talk things through and clear up any confusion before things got out of hand. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. It was framed as concern, for me, for the family, for misunderstandings. I didn't respond right away. That message told me he knew something was coming. Not details, but momentum. And it confirmed that my silence was no longer neutral to him. It was pressure. I replied 2 days later with a single sentence: "I'm handling what needs to be handled." No accusations, no explanations, just a statement of agency. After that, he went quiet. The consequences hadn't arrived yet, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations became tentative. Invitations felt cautious. There was a sense, unspoken but real, that something was moving beneath the surface. That was the hardest part to sit with. Knowing that people I loved were walking toward a moment they didn't yet understand and choosing not to warn them prematurely, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the process I'd already set in motion. Moving in silence wasn't about control. It was about integrity, about letting actions align with reality rather than emotions steering outcomes. I kept reminding myself, I didn't create this situation. I was responding to it, quietly, completely. By the time the first formal notices were sent, by people whose names I didn't know, on letterhead I didn't control, I was ready. Not emotionally armored, just resolved. Silence had carried me this far. Soon it would no longer be possible. But until then I stayed exactly where I was. Unannounced, unapologetic, and fully prepared. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They arrived in fragments, rippling outward in ways no one could immediately trace back to me. It started with confusion. My brother called our parents in a panic over something weird that had come up. He didn't say what it was, only that there had been a mistake and that he was sorting it out. His voice, from what my mother later described, sounded tight, controlled, but strained. I heard about it secondhand, a casual mention. Your brother's dealing with some paperwork issues, nothing to do with me, they assumed. At first, he tried to manage it quietly, the same way I always had. He made calls. He sent emails. He used language about errors and misunderstandings, but unlike me, he wasn't used to systems pushing back. When you deal with institutions, intent doesn't carry much weight. Timelines do, records do, and once a process begins, it doesn't pause to accommodate explanations. I noticed the change in him before anyone else did. His texts became erratic. He oscillated between friendliness and formality, as if trying to locate the version of me that would make this go away. I stayed consistent, calm, unavailable. Our parents sensed tension but couldn't place it. They tried to smooth it over the way they always had, by minimizing. It's probably just stress. These things blow over. Their instincts went toward comfort, not clarity. But this wasn't something comfort could touch. The letters arrived at their house now. Official ones. The kind you don't throw away, the kind that doesn't soften its language for family dynamics. Suddenly, there were meetings to attend, documents to review, questions that didn't have easy answers. Still, no one said my name out loud. There was a strange, suspended moment during this phase where everyone felt loss but couldn't identify its source. My brother lost ease. My parents lost certainty. The family lost its usual rhythm. And I lost the last illusion that this could remain contained. I watched it all from a distance that felt both protective and isolating. I wanted to reach out, to explain, to absorb the shock before it landed fully. But absorbing shock was what had brought me here. So I didn't. Instead, I prepared for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. I reviewed my notes. I rehearsed what I would say, and more importantly, what I would not say. No accusations, no history lessons, no emotional justifications. Facts, boundaries, endings. The first direct consequence came in the form of a call from my mother. Her voice was unsteady. "Is there something you're not telling us?" she asked. The question wasn't accusatory, it was bewildered, as if she sensed a missing piece and didn't know where to look for it. I told her we should talk in person. Not because I wanted drama, but because this wasn't a conversation for the phone. That call marked the end of the invisible phase. The consequences had reached the edges of the family, and gravity was doing the rest. What struck me most during that time was how unprepared everyone was for accountability. Not because they were bad people, but because our family had survived on smoothing things over, not addressing them directly. Accountability felt like an intruder. My brother stopped pretending everything was fine. He didn't confess, but he stopped performing normalcy. He knew something had slipped beyond his control. He just didn't know how far. I slept better than I had in months, not because I was enjoying the fallout, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. The weight was finally being distributed where it belonged. The consequences were only beginning. I could feel that. The system doesn't reveal everything at once. It unfolds. And with each unfolding, the story everyone had been telling themselves about who I was and what I would tolerate was starting to crack. By the time everyone realized how serious the situation was, the window for quiet solutions had already closed. That was the part no one wanted to accept. My brother tried first. Not directly at me, at the problem. He made calls to the lender, to anyone whose number he could find. He spoke quickly, confidently, as if speed itself could reverse the sequence of events. He framed everything as confusion, miscommunication, technical error. What he didn't understand was that processes don't respond to urgency. They respond to authority and evidence, and he no longer had either. When that failed, he tried a different approach. He called me late one night, the first time he'd done that in years. I let it ring. He followed up with a message that was longer than anything he'd sent me in months. He said he was stressed, that he was overwhelmed. Those things had gotten out of hand. He said he never meant for me to get caught up in anything. He said we should fix this together. That phrase, fix this together, felt almost tender, almost convincing. Almost. What it really meant was, help me carry this before it becomes visible. I didn't respond. The next day, my parents called. This time, they didn't circle. They asked directly what was happening, why my name was coming up, why documents pointed back to me. I told them the truth, not with heat, not with embellishment. I told them what I knew, when I knew it, and what I had already done. There was silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. My mother cried, quietly, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It had paperwork. My father asked if there was still a way to handle it privately. If we could pause things. I told him no, that the process didn't work that way, that pausing now would only make things worse for me. That was the moment they understood that I was no longer negotiating. The panic set in after that. Family meetings were called without me. Urgent conversations happened behind closed doors. I wasn't excluded out of malice. I was excluded because I had become the axis. Everything now rotated around my decision, and no one wanted to confront that directly. My brother tried again. This time the message was shorter, apologetic but vague. He said he'd make it right. He asked what he needed to do. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to punish him, but because it was no longer my job to tell him how to undo something he had chosen to do. The time for guidance had passed. What struck me during that phase was how quickly responsibility became a shared emotion. Once consequences became unavoidable, everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to soften the outcome. Everyone wanted me to bend, just a little, so the impact wouldn't land as hard. That was the cost of being the reliable one. Even when wronged, you're still expected to absorb. I didn't. By then, it was too late to fix it quietly. The system was already speaking in formal language. Records had been flagged, timelines were established, intentions, real or claimed, no longer mattered. And that finality brought something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness, not triumph, relief. Because ambiguity is exhausting, because uncertainty invites pressure, because once something becomes irreversible, the arguments stop looping. I stopped receiving calls asking what if. I stopped being asked to reconsider. The family shifted from prevention to acceptance, though no one said that out loud. My brother withdrew. Whether out of shame, fear, or resentment, I don't know. I didn't chase him. I had chased enough. What remained was fallout. Emotional, relational, structural. The kind that doesn't resolve quickly, the kind that changes the shape of things permanently. But the most important thing had already happened. I had chosen myself in a way that couldn't be undone. And no amount of panic, no matter how sincere, could reverse that choice. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was nothing like what people imagine when they hear that word. There was no shouting, no raised voices, no dramatic accusations hurled across a room. It was quiet, controlled, almost formal. We met at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. Neutral ground, familiar furniture, the same table we'd eaten at 1,000 times before. That normality did more to steady me than any preparation could have. My brother looked different. Not defeated, but tightened. Like someone bracing for impact that had already begun. He didn't meet my eyes at first. That, more than anything, told me how real this had become for him. I didn't start with a question. Questions invite debate. I started with a statement. I know what happened, I said, and I know when. My voice didn't shake. I wasn't trying to be strong, I just was. He opened his mouth, then closed it. My parents watched silently, their attention moving between us, unsure of their role now that the usual mediator, me, had stepped out of that position. I didn't agree to any of it, I continued, and I've already taken the steps I needed to take. That was it. No list, no explanation, no emotional appeal. He tried to explain anyway. He talked about pressure, about timing, about how he thought he'd fix it before it ever reached me. He said my name the way you say something fragile, as if speaking it carefully might undo the damage attached to it. I listened without interrupting, not because I needed to hear it, but because interrupting would have turned it into an argument, and I wasn't there to argue. When he finished, I nodded once. I believe you didn't intend to hurt me, I said. That doesn't change what you did. That sentence landed harder than anything else I could have said. It removed intention as a shield. It reframed the situation around impact and responsibility. My father asked if there was any way forward, any path that didn't involve more damage. There is, I said, but it doesn't involve me undoing what I've done to protect myself. No one challenged that. They couldn't. Not without admitting that my protection was optional. And they weren't ready to say that out loud. The conversation ended without resolution in the way families usually define it. No hugs, no promises, no timeline for healing, just an understanding that something fundamental had changed and that pretending otherwise would only cause more harm. I stood up to leave. My brother looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. I didn't think you'd do this, he said quietly. I met his gaze. I know. That was the truth. He hadn't thought I would. None of them had. Not because I was incapable, but because I had always chosen differently before. I left without slamming the door. Driving home, I expected to feel heavy. Instead, I felt light. Not relieved exactly, but unburdened. The confrontation hadn't given me closure, it had given me clarity. I didn't need them to agree with me. I needed them to understand that the version of me who absorbed harm to preserve comfort no longer existed. Confrontation without heat is disarming. It leaves nothing to react against. No anger to deflect, no emotion to manage. Just reality, standing where it always had, waiting to be acknowledged. And once it was, there was nothing left to say. For a long time after everything settled into its new shape, I resisted the idea that I had been changed. Change felt too dramatic a word, too close to loss. What I eventually realized was that I hadn't become someone else. I had stopped being who I was pretending to be. The quiet didn't leave me. If anything, it deepened. But it's a different quiet now. It isn't used to keep peace at my own expense. It's used to listen, to choose, to decide what deserves my energy and what doesn't. I still show up. I still care. I'm still capable of empathy. But I no longer confuse those qualities with obligation. The biggest shift happened internally. I stopped narrating myself through other people's comfort. I stopped pre-editing my thoughts in case they caused friction. I stopped assuming that being understood was more important than being accurate. My family dynamic changed in ways that are hard to explain to outsiders. There's distance now, not hostility, distance. Conversations are more careful, invitations less automatic. I'm no longer the emotional buffer in the room, and when tension arises, it stays where it belongs instead of being handed to me. At first, that felt lonely. Then it felt honest. My relationship with my brother exists in a quieter, narrower space. We speak occasionally, polite, measured. There are things we no longer pretend about. I don't ask for remorse. He doesn't ask for forgiveness. That space between us isn't healed, but it's real. And I've learned that reality is a form of respect. I used to believe that strength had to be visible to count. That if I wasn't asserting myself loudly, I wasn't asserting myself at all. This experience taught me something different. Restraint can be strength. Precision can be power. Calm can be immovable. The legal situation was resolved in time, but the emotional outcome mattered more to me. I learned that trust isn't something you owe by default. It's something people earn continuously, through consistency and respect. I learned that family love doesn't excuse boundary violations, and that refusing to enable harm is not betrayal. I'm more careful with my name now, not just legally, personally. I understand what it means to protect it. I don't over-explain my decisions. I don't rush to fill the silence. I let people sit with uncertainty if clarity would cost me too much. That doesn't make me cold, it makes me selective. There's a steadiness in my life now that I didn't have before. Not because everything is perfect, but because I'm no longer divided against myself. My actions align with my values. My silence aligns with my intent. If I've lost anything, it's the illusion that being indispensable makes you safe. And I don't miss that illusion. What I've gained is harder to name but easier to live with. Self-trust. The knowledge that if something feels wrong, I will investigate it. If a boundary is crossed, I will respond. And if the cost of peace is my own erasure, I will choose myself instead. Who I am now is someone who knows that quiet doesn't mean invisible, and that dominance doesn't have to announce itself to be real. It just has to hold. I used to think stories like this ended with a lesson neatly wrapped in certainty. A single sentence you could carry away and apply everywhere. Life isn't that clean. What it offers instead are truths that only make sense once you've lived them. Here's mine. Trust is not a feeling, it's a structure, and structures need boundaries to hold their shape. For years, I believed that being patient, forgiving, and low maintenance made me safe. I thought that if I didn't cause friction, I wouldn't become collateral. What I learned, slowly, painfully, is that silence without boundaries doesn't protect relationships. It only protects patterns. When my brother used my name to sign a loan I never approved, the damage wasn't just financial or legal, it was relational. It exposed how easily love can be used as cover and how quickly we're family can turn into an excuse to bypass consent. Choosing myself didn't feel heroic. It felt lonely. It felt like stepping out of a role I'd rehearsed my entire life without an understudy waiting to take my place. But it also felt honest. There's a difference between cruelty and consequence, between revenge and responsibility. I didn't seek to punish anyone. I sought to stop participating in my own harm, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you're the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who smooths things over so others don't have to, this isn't an invitation to harden. It's an invitation to notice, to ask whether your silence is a gift you're choosing to give or a cost you've been trained to pay. You don't owe anyone access to your name, your resources, or your peace just because you share history. Love that requires your erasure isn't love, it's convenience. I still believe in empathy. I still believe in grace. But I've learned that empathy without boundaries turns into self-abandonment, and grace without accountability teaches people that harm has no cost. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Quiet people are not passive people. And choosing yourself doesn't have to be loud to be final. Thank you for sitting with this story. If any part of it resonated with you, if you've ever faced a moment where protecting yourself meant disappointing someone you loved, I'd really like to hear from you.